I am going to talk about Steinbeck and religion. This talk has three parts. The first is his background, growing up an Episcopalian, his reading of the Bible. Secondly, I want to talk about his great attachment to place and to nature, what we might call deep ecology, and Steinbeck as a deep ecologist, or as a pantheist. Certainly for him, nature had spirit. And third, I want to talk about empathy. And really his acceptance of a pluralistic worldview and how each of those is an important aspect of Steinbeck's thinking about Steinbeck and religion. Part one is born an Episcopalian. Steinbeck was born in Salinas, California in 1902 and raised an Episcopalian. As a young boy, he became an altar boy, and this was one of his favorite stories about that experience, one he told both in nonfiction and in fiction, The Winter of Our Discontent. Once, he said, the bishop was officiating. A nice old man, hairless as a boiled onion, but to me, glowing with rays of holiness. So it was that, stunned with inspiration, I set the cross in the socket at the end of the processional and forgot to throw the brass latch that held it. At the reading of the second lesson, I saw with horror the heavy brass cross sway and crash on that holy, hairless head. The bishop went down like a poleaxed cow, and I lost the lace to a boy who couldn't sing as well, Skunkfoot Hill. It's an iconic moment for Steinbeck and perhaps the tipping point in his Episcopalian leanings. What is certainly true throughout his life, however, is that this author's spirituality was never narrowly channeled, either as an Episcopalian or as a true believer, like his grandmother Hamilton, who makes an appearance in East of Eden, who, as he said, knew every street in heaven. Steinbeck distrusted zealotry wherever he saw it. Indeed, one of the most negative portraits in The Grapes of Wrath is Mrs. Sandry, who at the government camp piles a sense of guilt on Rose of Sharon. Another revealing story about Steinbeck's church attendance is from his Stanford days. He attended Stanford from 1919 to 1925. And one weekend, a friend took John home to Berkeley, and John attended a church service with his mother. At one point in the sermon, he stood up and yelled to the crowd, "You all look satisfied here while outside the world begs for a crust of bread or a chance to earn it. Feed the body and the soul will take care of itself." The congregation was aghast. But John Steinbeck had set down his social spiritual path far from organized religion. Consider the hungry, care for the plight of others, whatever their faith or ethnic backgrounds. This I must fight against, Steinbeck wrote in East of Eden. Any idea, any religion or government which limits the individual or destroys the individual. This is what I am and what I am about. If John Steinbeck rejected strict religious credos, very much like Jim Casey in The Grapes of Wrath, he, like Casey, remained a seeker and a deeply empathetic and spiritual man. He embraced the principles of Christian love and commitment while rejecting the forms, the self-righteousness, and the emphasis on sin of any organized religion. Steinbeck had a spiritual streak that never left him. His widow Elaine told me in 1999, to me it sounds like he's a piece of bacon, but what she meant was that there's a spiritual quality to John. He didn't feel like he had to go to church on Sunday, she said, and he didn't. But he was a believer, but he was a reader of the Bible, a believer in spirit, a holistic thinker for whom nature yielded meaning, and a man of great empathy for all people, such as the spiritual and humanistic bedrock of Steinbeck's worldview. Back for a moment to that Episcopalian childhood. Like so many American children born on the cusp of a new century, educated before the First World War, Steinbeck was steeped in the King James Version of the Bible. As a child, he loved the sound of words. The cadences and musical prose bewitched him. He long insisted that he had the instincts of a minstrel rather than a scrivener. And when he was a 22-year-old student at Stanford, he He wrote a friend that he had discovered a beautiful word, probably the most beautiful in the world. It's the name of a town in Canaan, and I used it in my Bible story. It is Harosheth. In The Grapes of Wrath, Rose of Sharon's name is biblical, and Ma Jode loves the sound of it on her lips. He later said, sometimes the feel of words is like a round and warm emotion. John Steinbeck said that as he was writing The Grapes of Wrath. So listen to Steinbeck's stately prose, which often sounds so much like the King James Version of the Bible. He ensnares readers in musical sentences. Consider the opening paragraph of The Grapes of Wrath, or my favorite chapter, chapter 25, which is the most incendiary chapter in the book, where he says, "In the eyes of the people there is a failure. In the eyes of the hungry there is a growing wrath. In the souls of the people the grapes of wrath are filling and growing heavy for the vintage." From the Bible, and from Mallory's De Mort d'Arthur, which was his favorite book as a child, as a 10-year-old, Steinbeck learned the dignity and heft of sentences. He also mined biblical stories. The root of The Grapes of Wrath is Exodus, where the Oklahoma exiles journey to the promised land of California. Their restless energies and woes really reflect migrating peoples everywhere. And the impoverished Jodes become all peoples pushed from one land, journeying to another, and unwelcome in either. The root of East of Eden is that what he said was that powerful and profound and perplexing story in Genesis of Cain and Abel. The story with implications has made a deeper mark on people, Steinbeck continued, than any other, save possibly the story of the tree of life and original sin. Why was one son favored over another? Why is gift-giving fraught with the complexities of spirit? What meaning can be found in the tensions between fathers and sons? All of that is contained in East of Eden. In the Bible, Steinbeck found the stories that contain the perplexing truths of human experience, and he mined these narratives again and again. In The Pearl, for example, the Mexican peasants Kino and Juana fall from innocence to experience. The Passion of Christ marks Ethan Allen Hawley's fall in The Winter of Our Discontent, his last novel, published in the 1960s. Late in life, he considered writing the life of Christ from the four Gospels. Biblical stories and myths set out so lucidly for Steinbeck man's troubled steps through the world. In 1952, he handed screenwriter Jules Buck, who had worked on Viva Zapata, a package. "Here," he said, "I'm giving you the source material for all stories. You'll have no problems after this." Buck said, "John, what is it?" And John said, "It's the Bible." We read Steinbeck today in part because he wrote about the rocky paths of ordinary folk. Empathy is a word that comes up again and again when discussing this writer. And I want to close this section on Steinbeck's religious background by quoting something he said in 1951. "The writers of today, even I, have a tendency to celebrate the destruction of the spirit, and God knows it's destroyed often enough. But the beacon thing is that sometimes it is not. The great ones, Plato, Lao Tzu, Buddha, Christ, Paul, and the great Hebrew prophets, are not remembered for negation or denial. It's the duty of the writer to lift up, to encourage, to extend." Steinbeck's beacon list, his spiritual guides, cross-cultural boundaries. Part 2, how he was nurtured as a pantheist. If young John Steinbeck wrestled with church doctrine, he found respite always in nature. Nature was always for him, when he talked about it later, his years in Salinas Valley. It was secret, it was mystical, it was magical. You can see that to some extent in the marvelous Red Pony stories, where he describes nature with such precision. Comfortable round oaks, dumpling summer clouds, or on the fences, the shiny blackbirds with red epaulets clicked their dry call. The meadowlark sang like water and the wild doves concealed amongst the bursting leaves of the oaks made a sound of restrained grieving. Steinbeck's sentences record the rapt attention he paid and would have readers pay to the natural world. But to see with precision was only part of what Steinbeck meant when he talked about his love of nature. To see beyond the physical to underlying meaning was equally essential. And for him, the tide pool, which was so familiar to him because he spent summers in Monterey and Pacific Grove, was a powerful metaphor for considering the world deeply, to seeing beneath surfaces. He wrote, as an introduction to his friend biologist Ed Ricketts' book on the intertidal, Steinbeck wrote, "There are good things to see in the tide pools, and there are exciting and interesting things to be generated from the seeing. Every new eye applied to the peephole, which looks out at the world, may fish in some new beauty and some new pattern, and the world of the human mind must be enriched by such fishing." Let me look at Steinbeck's concern with deep ecology in yet another way. American literature is full of conquest narratives, the white explorer venturing across virgin land. But for John Steinbeck, nature is not a commodity, and animals aren't for slaughter, and the woods are not for felling, and peoples are not for conquering, although he recognized the historical patterns that make all this so. In contrast, Steinbeck's cultural and natural landscape is not man-centered, but holistic, with humans seen as species bound intimately to the places they inhabit. Characters in John Steinbeck's California novels, whether alone or in communities, are intimately connected to homes and land. In The Grapes of Wrath, for example, the people, the Okies, are introduced by the connection to the land, where Uncle John jumped over a feeny bush as big as a piano, and where Muley Graves' father got gored to death by his bull, and his blood is right here on the ground, right now. In each of Steinbeck's California novels in particular, environment similarly shapes inhabitants, and Steinbeck repeatedly demonstrates that bond. Lenny and George in Of Mice and Men are trapped, and they're always seen in very tight, enclosed spaces. In Cannery Row, Mac and the boys, the bums who live on the row, are survivors, and they dig into the palace flophouse, their home, like hermit crabs, the tenacious hermit crabs that they are. Steinbeck's is a vision of ecological connection, of human interdependence with nature and with one another. Our own interest, he writes in Sea of Cortez, which is his fullest statement about humans' connection to place, to one another, and to spirit. But he wrote there, our own interest lay in the connections and the relationships of animal to animal. If one observes in this relational sense, it seems apparent that species are only commas in a sentence, that each species is one the point and base of a pyramid, that all life is relationships. This connectedness is a kind of spiritual urgency in Steinbeck's fiction, to show how humans find sustenance in communities and felt connections with one another and with their environments. And as a footnote, I add that the book that everyone should read is not often taught is To a God Unknown, which was his second composed, third published novel. And it's really about a man who sees this connection with nature to be the ultimate sort of goal in life, to understand this fully and what this means. It's a kind of pantheistic text about which Steinbeck says it's about the world, not the world apart from man, but the world and man, the indescribable unit, man, for his and his environment. I want to close by reading one more passage from Steinbeck to really talk about how if nature is place, if it's connection, it's also spirit. And that's really what Steinbeck means by deep ecology. And here's a little passage from Travels with Charlie, when Steinbeck goes to the redwoods. Everybody remembers Charlie the dog being awed by the trees, but so was Steinbeck. From my earliest childhood, I felt something was going on in the grove, something of which I was not a part. There's a breathing in the black, for these huge things that control the day and inhabit the night are living things and have presence and feeling, and somewhere deep down perception and perhaps communication. So what he's trying to say here, and he says it best in Sea of Cortez, is that the feeling that we call religious in life is one of the most prized and used and desired reactions of our species, is really the understanding and the attempt to say that man is related to the whole thing, related inextricably to all reality, known and unknown. Again, to this end, I suggest you read, see the little film, Forgotten Village, which talks about this in another context in terms of the beliefs of Mexican villagers, or he also wrote the story, the Virgin of Guadalupe. So his concern with place, spirit, and religion, again, I think crossed cultural boundaries. Finally, part 3, I want to briefly discuss empathy in relation to the little book that's read so frequently of Mice and Men. In every bit of honest writing in the world, Steinbeck wrote in the late 1930s, there's a base theme: try to understand men. I silently add women as well, of course. He wrote that as he was composing Of Mice and Men, which is, of course, a little novel that asks readers to understand and accept what is. Something That Happened was the working title of this study. Initially, what has happened between true traveling men is something extraordinary, unlikely, but deep friendship that bleeds into love. Eventually, what happens is inevitable in a world where the vulnerable don't survive. Of course, Lenny dies. Steinbeck asks readers to understand dreams and the loss of dreams. He demands that readers recognize that not even Slim's consideration at the end of the book can repair the loss of Lenny and the extraordinary friendship. Steinbeck packs this little book with a deep understanding for the marginalized, be it Lenny or Candy or Crooks, and a steady acceptance of things that happens. His is not acquiescence, but simply a deep empathy and understanding of the world as it is. And in this book, Steinbeck asks readers to understand that a woman like Curly's wife is more than a tart that the men accuse her of being. To the ranch hands, she's one-dimensional, but to a sensitive reader, she's lonely, needy, visionary, and adrift. Steinbeck asks readers to understand something about the ethnic mix of California, Crook's exclusion. It's a very rich and very empathetic book. So in closing, I want to say, in Steinbeck's long career, from 1929, the year he published his first novel, Cup of Gold, until 1968, when he died. His last work was written in 1966, American Americans, essays about his really response to the American culture in the 1960s, which also discusses religion in America. But throughout this career, Steinbeck committed himself to understanding human nature to the best of his ability. Usually that meant he wrote about what he witnessed. Seeing clearly was a necessary part of the writer's commission. But equally urgent was his desire to make that understanding a felt experience for the reader, to bring together mind and heart. So let me close with what that means with one more quotation from Sea of Cortez. He says, "A man looking at reality brings his own limitations to the world. If he has strength and energy of mind, the tide pool stretches both ways, digs back to electrons and leaps space into the universe and fights out of the moment into non-conceptual time. Then ecology has a synonym, which is all." So an all-encompassing vision, that I think is something that Steinbeck has, be it in terms of the biblical stories he told, be it in terms of his view of nature, or be it in terms of his empathy for marginalized people everywhere. Thank you very much.